Hello, my name is Jared Ludlow, Publications Director at the BYU Religious Studies Center, your weekly resource for gospel scholarship. Today I'm joined by Addie Marshall, one of
Hi.
our student editing interns, and we will be discussing some possible resources that can accompany your Come Follow Me reading for December 11th through 17th, Revelation chapter 6 through 14. The first article is called The Apocalyptic Imagination and the New Testament by Thomas Wayment, a classics professor at BYU, and it comes from the Sperry Symposium volume. And he starts off pointing out that over the course of human history, the Lord has revealed to his prophets various apocalyptic dreams and visions. The terms apocalyptic and apocalypse are derived from a Greek word meaning to reveal, to disclose, or to bring to light. The term apocalypse also refers to the title of the portion of Scripture known as the Book of Revelation, and has been used subsequently to describe writings that touch upon similar themes. In our day, the word apocalyptic describes a whole body of literature produced by early Christians and others. In the New Testament, for example, Matthew 24, Mark 13, Luke 17, and portions of 1st and 2nd Thessalonians and Jude all contain apocalyptic revelations. So his goal in looking at this article is to examine the social context in which many early Christian apocalypses were revealed and discuss where possible how the early saints reacted to these new revelations. So, Addie, what did you learn from this article?
Yeah, I thought this was really interesting to see the different perspectives of how you can look at apocalyptic literature. Like, we can choose to see it in a hopeful light, as like, oh, Jesus is coming back and things are going to get better. Or we can be scared and troubled about all these kind of odd signs that are in these revelations. But I thought it was interesting that we have that ability to kind of interpret it our own way, especially when you consider, like you mentioned, how the saints in like Christ or Paul's time would have been looking at this. Like, they were going through a lot of really troubling things, and they probably were looking forward to these revelations and these things that were going to come, just because they were being severely persecuted and were having a rough time. So hearing all these things that were going to happen were probably very hopeful to them, whereas now we kind of look at it and are like, oh my gosh, that's so scary. But for their context, that was a very hopeful thing. And so having that ability to interpret them two different ways, I think just brings more to us as we study the scriptures, and that we're able to find hope in these sometimes troubling and mysterious revelations that we're reading about.
Well, that's a great point because, yeah, they are meant to be hopeful in the end. Mm-hmm. But you're right. They also prophesy of a lot of challenging things, tribulations and persecutions and weird symbols and things like you said.
Yeah.
And so I think that's one of the purposes that Dr. Wayman had with this article, is to emphasize ultimate hope, in them, and not let the heavier matter weigh us down too much.
Exactly, yeah.
And so the way he kind of approaches this article is he goes through different principles that you can find common in a lot of apocalyptic literature. And I'll just list some of these. They include dualism, the fight between good and evil, a world in decline, finding hope in apocalyptic destruction, which you talked about, persecution of the saints, tribulation that defines true Christians, a reminder for continued obedience, pessimism will not prevail, and that Christ will come again and there'll be an ultimate victory. And so I like kind of one of his closing statements is that although immediate victory may not be won, ultimate and complete victory will be. Mm-hmm. So there'll be some hard times, but ultimate victory will come. The second article is called Insights from the JST, the Joseph Smith translation, into the Book of Revelation. It's by Gerald Lund, a former church education system administrator, and it comes from a volume that the RSC published called the Joseph Smith Translation, The Restoration of Plain and Precious Truths. I thought it was interesting how he starts off this article because he talks about how the Book of Revelation is one of the most intriguing and controversial books in the biblical library. And most scholars agree that it is one of the most difficult books in either the Old or New Testaments, and I personally agree with that. Typically, modern readers, including Latter-day Saints, find its imagery strange, its prophecies filled with bizarre and baffling imagery, and its message unclear. So when we turn to Joseph Smith, it's somewhat shocking when he says in a sermon in 1843 that the Book of Revelation is one of the plainest books God has ever caused to be written, right? And so what's interesting is when we look at the Joseph Smith translation, if you compare all the changes Joseph Smith makes in various books, Book of Matthew, for example, the Gospel of Matthew, and the Book of Genesis, there's a lot of changes. Over half of the verses have some change and these kinds of things. But in the case of the Book of Revelation, he only added 3 new verses and made changes in only 90 of the 394 verses, or 23% of the total. And a lot of those changes aren't really that significant. Whereas in the Book of Genesis, we have entire chapters that are added that we now find in the Book of Moses, for example, and so forth. So, the conclusion is that John's Revelation was meant to be understood when it was first written, and it's meant to be understood today. Mm-hmm. So what did you take away from this article?
Yeah, honestly, kind of just that. Like, God doesn't give us things without expecting us to understand them. And yeah, kind of when you were reading about Joseph Smith, I was thinking it kind of reminded me of when Christ comes to the Americas and he tells people, like, you should be reading Isaiah. And like, how Nephi says, Isaiah is so clear and easy to understand. And nowadays we're like, what are you talking about? But that was kind of what I got from Joseph Smith, saying this is the easiest book of scripture to read. It's like, what are you talking about? Revelations is so confusing. But I got some hope from hearing that, or realizing that God isn't going to give us scripture without either giving us the capacity to understand it or the ability to understand it. And so there are tools out there. And overall, just as I was reading this article, I was just very grateful for the work that Joseph Smith has done and for the work that other scholars have done, because it's really fascinating to just read through like what all these things could mean and the different interpretations, and how even just some of those small changes that Joseph Smith makes it easier for us to understand today.
Great. Yeah, and he does list some of the outcomes, I guess, from the instrumentality of Joseph Smith that he did. He mentions 4 major things that he did. Brought forth latter-day scripture that can explain some of the things. He gave some non-scriptural sermons and writings. And then we have Doctrine and Covenants, section 77, that answers some questions about the book of Revelation. And then, as we mentioned, some of the Joseph Smith translation revisions of the text. And so he will focus on these 4 aspects, but very briefly on the first 2, but then mostly on section 77, the Doctrine and Covenants, and the JST revisions, to show how they can help us understand some aspects of the book of Revelation. Now, having said all that, he does point out that it's not meant to imply that the book of Revelation is simple or easily understood. Elder McConkie, when he talked about this concept, he says, if we apply ourselves with full purpose of heart, we'll start to understand it. So it does take some effort on our part and really focus on it. And then he went on to say, the language and imagery of the book of Revelation is so chosen as to appeal to the maturing gospel scholar, to those who already love the Lord and have some knowledge of his goodness and grace. And so it will take a little more effort, a little more study, and a little more connection with other scriptures to fully understand. And again, we're thankful for Joseph Smith that helped lay out some of those additional resources, I guess you could say, that we could learn from.
Yeah,